Hi, everybody. I'm Kara Horowitz. Along with Sean Hecht, I co-direct our environmental law program at UCLA Law, the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. And I'm going to be moderating our technology panel today. I'm really excited about it, and we have fabulous speakers. The heart of our panel today is talking about how close we are to getting to what Mary Nichols called our North Star of zero-emission technology. And I have with me today to talk about this Joe Liu, who's the president and CEO of the Coalition for Clean Air and is also the governor's appointee to the South Coast Air Quality Management District, which is our local air regulator, to its governing board. Thank you, Joe. I have Jimmy O'Day in the middle, who's the Senior Vehicles Analyst at the Union of Concerned Scientists. He works up in Oakland with UCS, where he specializes in heavy-duty vehicle technology and policy. Thank you, Jimmy. And Renee Moilanen, who's the Manager of Air Quality Practices at the Port of Long Beach. And there she oversees the port's efforts to reduce air pollution and community impacts. And so the structure of, oh, you got a shout out. And thank you very much. Special for Renee. Thank you, Renee. So today we're going to structure our conversation this way. Each of the three panelists is going to give brief-ish opening remarks, sharing with us their worldview on this question of the technology, the sort of state of technology and technology readiness for zero-emission freight and goods movement related to port emissions. And then we're going to have a moderated conversation with all of us up here, and I will be sure to save time at the end for questions for those of you who want to engage in our conversation. And we're going to start with Renee, who's going to talk about relevant port plans and technologies. Thanks so much, Renee.
All right, thank you. So for us at the Port of Long Beach and Port of Los Angeles, our driver for zero emissions is our Clean Air Action Plan. This was a plan that we originally adopted back in 2006. It's our comprehensive strategy for reducing emissions from ships, trucks, trains, terminal equipment. And in the last 10 years, we've seen significant progress. So since 2005, our diesel particulate matter is down 88%. Nitrogen oxides are down 56%. But we knew that we needed to do more. So last year, the two ports adopted an update to the Clean Air Action Plan. And what made this new Clean Air Action Plan so different from the previous plans that we'd adopted is that for the first time, the ports set quantitative goals for getting to zero emissions. And that was largely informed by many of the efforts at the state level. So specifically, the goals that we have for terminal equipment, up to 100% zero emissions terminal equipment by 2030, and for trucks, up to 100% zero emission trucks by 2035. And then we have some near-term targets for near zero emissions that are in there. So these are extremely aggressive goals. And there are likely to be, there are definitely going to be significant costs associated with getting to these goals. So for us at the ports in the near term, we're focused on three things, which I'll primarily talk about today. Technology advancement, infrastructure development, and funding advocacy. On the technology advancement side, this is critical because today there are very few options for zero emissions terminal equipment and trucks that are commercially available. And this is probably the toughest duty cycle for zero emissions equipment for electric or fuel cell in the port environment. We operate 24/7. There are limited opportunities for recharging. We're pulling heavy loads up steep grades. So this is probably the toughest test of whether zero emissions can work. So the ports have a technology advancement program where we fund emerging technologies and the testing of these emerging technologies. Since 2007, with the port funding that we've put in, plus funds that we've leveraged through our partners, such as the South Coast Air Quality Management District, we've invested more than $85 million in technology demonstrations for things like zero emissions trucks and zero emissions terminal equipment. We've also been very fortunate to receive funding from the state, the California Air Resources Board and the California Energy Commission, to do some additional testing of zero emissions equipment. And in the next couple of years, in the 2020-2021 timeframe, the ports will be deploying more than 50 pieces of zero emissions terminal equipment and trucks as a result of this funding. Now, once we've got the technologies, which we don't have yet, but when we feel like the performance is at the level of the diesel equivalent, we need to shift very quickly to deployment. And that's where the infrastructure development comes in. And right now, that is, I would say, probably our biggest challenge is the infrastructure. We need to be able to charge these pieces of equipment, and we don't have the infrastructure in place for more widespread deployment or even large pilots. We're finding that that's an issue. So one of the things that we're doing at the Port of Long Beach is we are developing a port electric vehicle blueprint. And this is in partnership with the California Energy Commission. We received funding from them to do this blueprint. And over the next year, we'll be working with many different stakeholders to look at how we get this infrastructure in place. Where do we site it? What are the charging standards that we're going to use? Because that's a big issue. We don't have heavy-duty charging standards. How do we finance it? How do we pay for it? What are the community benefits and the community impacts associated with this transition? So that's an effort that we're working on now. And it's going to take time to get this infrastructure in place, years to design and construct. And then we get to funding. So this equipment is much more expensive than diesel today, on the order of 2 to 3 times higher. The infrastructure we've estimated just at the Port of Long Beach will be about $800 million over the next 10 years. We've been very fortunate to have funding from the state. We appreciate that funding. And one of the challenges that we face is that the funding is often appropriated on a yearly basis, which makes it a little bit hard for us to predict what's coming. We would love to know that there's going to be long-term, consistent funding so we can really start planning for the infrastructure that has to go in and the deployments, and so that our industry has a little bit more certainty about where those incentives will be coming from. So, the bright side is that 10 years ago, when we first passed our original cap, I don't think any of us could have predicted the pace of zero emissions development that has happened. We are seeing major equipment manufacturers get into this. Peterbilt, Kenworth, Kalmar, Taylor. These are the big names, and these are the companies that are going to make zero emissions a reality. They're making the investment in zero emissions, which we did not predict 10 years ago. We also have, in the Port of Long Beach, a new container terminal that uses almost entirely zero emissions equipment. In fact, that's a picture up there, if you can barely see it, of our Middle Harbor terminal. And this was a unique situation. It was a brand new terminal built from scratch, and so a lot of the environmental considerations were built into that. But the point is, it's no longer science fiction. It can be done with the right amount of time and resources. And then the last thing I'll say is that in our Clean Air Action Plan, we did an assessment of where we were with zero emissions equipment and where we thought we might be in a few years. So in 2017, there were 333 pieces of zero emissions equipment operating at the ports. We took a look at what we knew was going to be coming in the next 5 years. Just what we knew was coming, not any new grants or any new funding that might come out. And in 2025, we expect to have 573 pieces of zero emissions equipment. That's more than a 70% increase in 5 years for equipment that is not even commercially available. So to us, that's a sign of the significant progress. We know we've got a lot more to do, but we think we're well on our way.
Okay, that's great, Renee. Thank you. All right, Jimmy, how do you see this space? Yeah, and you're welcome to use the podium, and there is a clicker up there. Or do you want the clicker at your seat?
I'll stand up.
Okay,
Sure.
go for it.
Oh, it's Joe. Joe's up.
That's definitely me.
Sorry, Joe.
I get the clicker.
I told these folks we were going to roll with it a little bit, so we're rolling with it.
I'm ready. I'm willing. This is our mission. This is kind of what makes me do what I'm doing. And I'm going to go through the needs, because I was asked to talk about the needs, and then I'm going to talk about what I see as the pathways forward. And I'm going to do it pretty quickly because my slides are too many, and Kara's going to knock me out of here if I don't go too long.
I told him I'm going to be mean
That's
as
right.
a moderator.
And I feel sorry for those of you who have seen this from me so many times, because I know a lot of you out here, and I know I've talked about this a million times. In order to get to attainment of federal air quality standards on time, we have to have 45% NOx emission reductions by 2023. NOx is a precursor to smog, and 45% NOx emissions by 2023 is difficult to say the least. 55% by 2031 to attain different federal air standards. And we have Amy and Francisco back there from EPA who are staring at me and saying, you got to do it. So we got to do it. Now, what are the port's contribution to this problem? NOx comes from primarily freight transportation sources. In 2031, when we hit that deadline, 5 of the top 6 sources of NOx are related to freight emissions. The San Pedro Bay ports are our #1 source of NOx emissions, and heavy-duty trucks are the #1 source within that entire inventory in 2031. It has public health impacts. Not only do we have ground-level ozone and smog, but we have air toxics. The state of California has estimated that in 2012, 2,200 people died prematurely because of the freight industry alone. Now, to put this in perspective, in 2015, I looked up the number of homicides in California, less than 2,000. So you got to think about it, and the cost per year estimated at $20 billion. So those are the needs. Paths forward. I'm going to talk about 3 different paths forwards I've been thinking about a lot lately. The first one is dealing with what I think is a prisoner's dilemma that we've stuck ourselves into in the alternative fuel sector. The second is being honest and admitting the shortcomings of the technologies, and then moving on from there and being an effective advocate to make sure this actually moves forward as quickly as it must. Unlike Vincent van Gogh's Crows Over the Wheat Field, the 3 different pathways don't lead to 3 different outcomes. The 3 different pathways lead to a single outcome, which is a clean environment. I don't know how many of you remember the prisoner's dilemma, but it was a 1950s game theorist development. Economists and psychologists got really excited about this because you had 2 different prisoners being interrogated by prison officials, and depending on what they decided, there were different outcomes. If they both decided to confess, they would stay in jail for a very, very long time. If they both decided to remain silent, then they would be in jail, but for a very short time. If one of them confessed and the other didn't, then that's the worst outcome for one of them. The one who remained silent ended up getting a lot of time in prison. So I am applying this to our alternative fuel sector because of the infighting that I see happening between zero-emission advocates and near-zero-emission advocates. Because the way that I see it is when they compete with each other and fight with each other and are dissing each other's technology all day long, every day, the only people who are really winning are the petroleum industry and the traditional fuels. But if they were, wow, they're easy. If they cooperate, they can both win. If one cooperates and one competes, then it's not going to be good for one of them. You can also think about this if you had a pie. These alternative, this is the heavy-duty fuel sector pie. The alternative fuel sector is fighting over this really little slice of the pie. And meanwhile, the Western States Petroleum Association and their friends and colleagues are eating all the rest of the pie. There is a very big pie, there's a lot of pie, and I think that the alternative fuels, there's plenty of pie for the alternative fuel sectors, both zero and near zero, to proceed. Oh, I'll go through this really quickly because I know I only have 10 minutes. We did a poll a couple months ago on voters' opinions about zero versus near zero, and we can go through the details later. We oversampled in impacted communities in San Joaquin Valley and 710 Corridor, Inland Empire, and West Oakland. And we asked them about zero emissions, explained to them about zero emissions and near zero emissions, and asked the questions in a random order, sometimes one first and sometimes the other first, half of each, so it wouldn't impact it. And what we found was widespread voter support for both, for near zero emission and for zero emissions. Less than 1 in 10 supported only doing one or the other. And so we've got voter support for this. I just wanted to put that up there too. But on to the very important thing, which is my favorite podcast. I'm going to ask you to listen to this. We have it hooked up and it's supposed to be playing on the audio when I hit the next slide. Preet Bharara with Stay Tuned. For you lawyers, you got to listen to it because he is a former U.S. attorney in the southern section of New York from 2009 to 2017. President Trump fired him when he wouldn't take his phone call, and he has this wonderful podcast I love to listen to. You know, he made his reputation on prosecuting Wall Street bankers, mafiosos, and corrupt public officials and terrorists. And he had on his podcast last week a defense attorney, not only a defense attorney, but the defense attorney, Ben Brofman. And Ben Brofman is the guy who represented Puff Diddy and Michael Jackson and mafiosos, and now our favorite person to hate, Henry Weinstein. And so you would think that this prosecutor and this defense attorney wouldn't agree on much, but if you listen to this, Preet goes first, they do agree on something. Let's see if it works.
You raised something I think is very important, and that is the need to sometimes concede. And people don't concede as much as they should. That's true in politics, it's true in business negotiations, and it's true in the law. You know, you get these people, they come in and they don't want to give up on any point at all. One thing you're taught as a prosecutor, at least I was, and I think it's a good training, that if there's something that is not in your favor, concede it and say why it's not important. But you earn credibility that way, and you earn trust that way. I see a lot of lawyers, unlike you, who will never give on any point, and they think that's what fighting is. That's what losing is often.
I agree, and you have clients who refuse to let you stipulate sometimes because they want to fight on everything. And in the cases where I've stipulated, when the stipulation is read, I've stood up in front of juries with the stipulation and said, they didn't prove this. I agreed.
What's the biggest mistake people make when they're arguing to a jury?
I think not having eye contact with the jurors they're trying to influence. I think it's a mistake that they sometimes talk down to people. I think they sometimes talk over people's heads. You know, I'm a person who law firms come to on occasion, not criminal defense lawyers. I've tried cases for law firms who say, this is such a complicated case, we need to make it jury friendly. I've been taught and I've learned and I believe that every case has a heart. And you need to find the heart and you need to either expose it or cover it up, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And I really think that sometimes making a case jury friendly when the other side isn't, gets the jury to rely on you. They get to see you as the honest broker. They see to you in the judge as the person who's not trying to confuse and obfuscate, and that you're the person who's going to enlighten them.
Well, that's exactly the direction we give to prosecutors, that you have to be the reliable one. That's why you concede when the point is worth conceding. That's why you don't overstate. That's why you don't exaggerate. That's why you don't get emotional, because you have to be the definitive voice of truth in the courtroom.
Well,
So I'm driving around listening to podcasts because it's the only way to maintain my sanity in Los Angeles is to listen to podcasts while I drive. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I got to come up with something to say when I come here to UCLA. And I listened to this and I thought, well, why wouldn't I apply this to heavy duty trucks and electrification and talk about what we should concede in order to have credibility and and be open and honest about what the shortcomings are. There are plenty of shortcomings, and I think we need to get those out of the way and talk about them before we can move on. So I've got them listed here. You don't need to, we're not going to go through every single one of them, but generally it's safe to say that we should all be able to agree and to concede that the technology is not as advanced as it needs to be. The technology is currently far too expensive, that it has limited availability, and we've got problems with fueling and charging infrastructure, and none of this is moving around solely on sunshine and wind and other renewable resources, that every one of these relies to some extent on petroleum products just to move these containers around. Having done that, we can also look at the upside, the bright side. And the bright side is that zero-emission freight transportation is going to be the future. We are going to get there. The question really is how and how long will it take. There is a lot of activity and a lot of progress, a lot of investment. The traditional OEMs that Renee was talking about are getting in. Daimler, Volvo, and VW are getting involved, and they're being pushed by Tesla and by BYD and by TransPower and US Hybrid. So there is a lot of upside that we can talk about too. There's incentive money, and to a large extent the technology really is becoming less and less of the barrier the money really is. And we need to agree on who's going to pay for it, and we're going to make a lot of progress if we do. The other problem is that this is all not happening as quickly as we need it to happen. Remember those 2023 deadlines. There's my 10 minutes. Path 3, being an effective advocate. Focus on policy, technology, money, and leadership. There is a lot of policy commitments we need to see fulfilled. There's some more policies that need to happen. We have to make sure that we're effective in advocating for all these things. So just to conclude, the 3 paths forward that I'm talking about are dealing with the prisoner's dilemma, cooperating instead of competing, making sure that we concede the shortcomings of the technology, and then, of course, being effective advocates and making sure that it all moves forward. So, Jimmy, I assume your slides are next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. I would have given you 2 more minutes if you wanted it.
That's okay, I'm just done.
Okay. Now, Jimmy, thank you.
All right. There are many indicators that heavy-duty vehicles are the next frontier for electrification, whether it's manufacturers' commitments, fleet announcements, huge policy decisions, the Public Utilities Commission decision we saw last week, $350 million coming to Southern California, 25% of that for the ports. The VW decision the week before, $160 million coming towards port-related trucks and equipment. One of the biggest indicators to me, though, is how quickly my slides go out of date. I gave a talk a month ago at Stanford, and these slides are already out of date. That's how fast this industry is moving, and it's a very good problem to have. This is a picture of the Port of Oakland, one of the other ports. I share Chair Nichols' fascination with the industrial activity that happens at these ports. I took this picture on a run. A group of friends, we run Saturday mornings, and most weekends we run by the port. There's no truck activity on the weekends, and it's actually a decent place to run. The streets are empty, and you can run literally down the middle of the streets and have these unique views that not many people see. Just a few pieces of numbers for context. Looking at heavy-duty trucks and buses in the state context, they make up a small fraction of vehicles on the road, about 7%. But they disproportionately contribute to climate change and air quality. 20% of global warming emissions from the transportation sector, 27% of PM 2.5 emissions from transportation, and really an astonishing 40% of emissions from transportation. A big chunk of the rest of the NOx is other stuff that happens at ports. And I don't think I need to harp on this point too much for this audience, but there's disproportionate impacts of this pollution. If you live near a highway, near a freight facility, you experience a disproportionate impacts of the pollution. And even though I think we all know this, I think the more that we say this and talk about it, the closer we can get to overcoming those inequities. This colorful graph shows total global warming emissions in California over a number of years, the last 15 years or so, broken up by fuel. The important thing about this series of bars showing our emissions are where we need to get. 2020, we're on track. I think we'll hit the 2020 goal. 2030 and 2050 are pretty steep targets that is going to take a lot of work, and a lot of work today to meet goals that are 12 years out or more. It really starts with things that we're doing today, and conferences like this are exactly one of those. I want to pull out just a few of the fuels shown from that last slide. And you may be surprised to see that natural gas is one of the larger sources of emissions in California. I would have thought gasoline for sure. And I show this just, I think Joe and others have raised the point of, there are these conversations around which fuel and where do we head in the future. And just from a climate perspective, we're using a lot of natural gas across other sectors, and that really frames how I think about where we need to get in the future. And of course, I guess it's also important to acknowledge the biomethane and the waste. Very important to capture these sources of fugitive methane emissions and put them to use. But we have to acknowledge that, of course, these are limited resources as well. One of the questions that we get at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and we find ourselves answering most frequently, are what are the life cycle emissions of zero-emission technologies. Of course, zero-emission applies, of course, to the tailpipe. And looking at transit buses as an example, representative of other types of heavy-duty vehicles, we see that battery electric buses on today's grid in California have about 4 times lower emissions than a diesel bus or a CNG bus. A fuel cell bus is about 50% lower, so also significant global warming benefits that if we increase the amount of hydrogen from renewable sources, that would improve even more. So the state of technology of heavy-duty electric vehicles, we really can't talk about it without acknowledging the progress that has been made in the light-duty sector. We're seeing a number of different manufacturers enter the arena and begin offering products with longer and longer ranges. These 4 vehicles are 4 electric vehicles and a hydrogen fuel cell, the Toyota Mirai, that I saw a couple weeks ago on my walk to work, all within a quarter mile of each other in the Bay Area. And certainly California is a leader, but really cool to see these vehicles, people making the decisions to buy these vehicles. This was also parked in front of one of my neighbor's house. This is a pickup truck that they converted to a battery electric. And it really goes to show how simple this technology is in a lot of ways. If someone can do a homebrew conversion of their pickup truck to an electric vehicle, I think there's room for the big OEMs to start shifting some of their production lines as well. We also can't talk about state of heavy-duty electric technology without talking about the amazing progress we've seen for transit buses. This is a battery electric bus made by BYD that I rode with many others from Santa Monica out to BYD's manufacturing facility in Lancaster. This bus did 300 miles in a single day. It charged while we took a tour, and the bus driver drove to Santa Monica, back to Lancaster, and then did that twice in the course of dropping us off. Getting on one of these buses, touring the factory, all this becomes very real. And if you haven't had the opportunity to do this, I certainly encourage you to do that, because I think you'll be surprised at how far things are coming. This NASCAR logo type slide shows the progress we're making on transit buses in California. There's 40 transit agencies across the state that have purchased or are currently operating zero-emission battery electric fuel cell buses. This is really amazing, and we're making incredible progress here as well. So trucks, as was mentioned earlier, there's a lot of manufacturers getting into this game. Here's 9 different Class 8 trucks shown. There's others I could have put up here, such as the Freightliner announcement from 2 days ago that they are planning on a 2021 production of a Class 8 250-mile truck. Freightliner has 40% of the market share of Class 8 trucks. Huge announcement. And so, I show this. We're not there today, for sure. A lot of these trucks are shown are trucks that have been announced. They've all been made. They're all, you can go online and find videos of all these trucks, touring around doing demonstrations. So the technology is there. We still have ways to get to the production of these trucks at a meaningful scale. That's going to happen in the next 5 years. I think we're going to see even more progress. And so you have, established manufacturers. Kenworth, BYD, of course, is established manufacturer in China. To these startups, Thor Trucks, down here in LA, a couple of 20-something young kids out of college started Thor Trucks, and here they have a 300-mile electric truck that they're demonstrating. We're making a lot of progress, and I'm a glass half full person on this. We still have a ways to go to fill the glass up, but it wasn't too long ago that the glass was entirely empty. So we're only filling the glass up. The performance of electric technology, I think, is best demonstrated by this video that Toyota put together. Oh, will the video show? It's okay if it doesn't.
It showed when I played it yesterday for me, but maybe it won't work here, I'm not sure. Guess which one was faster off the line?
Yeah, it's a fuel cell truck doing very well.
Here we go.
Out of frame. And out of frame. I mean, I watch this video all the time, and it amazes me every time. We're doing well. There's still a lot of kinks to work out. I don't want to oversell my optimism that we're here today, that there's not a lot of challenges to do, to overcome, but we're definitely getting closer every day, every month. I want to end on this. May 6, 1954, Roger Bannister became the first person to break 4 minutes in the mile. No one thought it was possible. I think he probably did, his training partners. And there was a certain psychological barrier to doing this, just like summiting Mount Everest. Roger Bannister was the first person to do it, but 6 weeks later, someone else did it. John Landy of Australia ran a second and a half faster. You could say that this is where we are with the electric truck technology, that maybe we've had our Bannister moment with Tesla's announcement, or whatever your favorite announcement is, that maybe we've had, the barrier's been broken, and things are only going to go up. Just as training methods have improved, Roger Bannister broke the 4 minute mile on 28 miles a week. He was a medical student. We know a lot more about physiology and how to train. High school kids have broken 4 minute miles. So I'm very optimistic that where we're headed is up, and I think there's a number of examples in history showing that barriers can be broken and we can do this.
Thanks, Jimmy. Thank you, guys. So I heard each of you talk at least a little bit about the current state of technology, and in particular to take what I think I'll characterize as pretty consistent standpoints on how far we've come, but also how far we still have to go to get to a zero emissions goods movement freight future. So Renee told us the tech's not ready yet, but it's no longer sci-fi, right? I agree with you, Jimmy. It makes a big difference to actually visit one of these electric vehicle manufacturing facilities. I took a group of law students in my climate law and policy class to Proterra's facility, electric bus manufacturing facility, last semester, and they were totally blown away. It was really incredible to be able to stand in a real manufacturing facility, creating real jobs for people in the community. And we got to tour around in a little bus. It was incredible. And yet, I know there's still a lot more that needs to be done. So I want to have a more detailed conversation about in what areas technological advancements need to happen in order to create the zero emission goods movement future. What are the places where we've sort of come pretty far and we're really close, and what are the areas of technology that really do still need significant further advancements? And I'll ask each of you to answer the question. It doesn't really matter in what order. Joe, we could start with you if you want.
Okay, this is on, right? Okay. Well, first and foremost, battery technology needs to advance, which it is advancing. And it's advancing very, very quickly and somewhat predictably, but perhaps not totally. There may be a leapfrog moment if new battery technologies are developed that can maintain the charge-recharge system, but current technologies are advancing very quickly in terms of energy density and reduced cost. And so that deals with the weight, it deals with the expense. That's the number one thing. But I attended the ACT Expo. Shout out to Gladstein Nandros and Associates over there, and Eric. And one of the more exciting things, in all honesty, I saw was Meteor that does components, brakes and other things for heavy-duty technology, had come up with an axle that incorporated an electric motor, the axle, and a transmission, all in what is not much bigger than the axle. And that eliminates the need for any kind of a drive shaft, and it actually makes room for a lot more batteries and put the batteries lower so that the trucks handle even better. And that was really exciting. And the folks who buy their parts from people like Meteor were really excited at a development like that. So there is a lot of innovation that can and still will happen. And certainly there were announcements about fuel cell and hybrid battery electric and fuel cell electric trucks coming out. There is a lot going on. And if you want to know what's being innovated and what's happening, I really suggest going to the ACT Expo.
Yeah, I mean, I would also add that, and I mentioned this a little bit, and I know a lot of speakers today will probably talk to the implementation challenges of zero emissions. The duty cycles are unlike anything in the light duty sector, and maybe even the buses. To operate at a port terminal, and the expectation from our terminal operators is that a piece of equipment will run for a full 8-hour shift, no loss of power. They will then have 1 hour as a charging opportunity, which may not be enough, and then run another full 8-hour shift. And then they may get a 3 to 4 hour window on the back end to do some significant recharging. So I think for our operators, it's the range. We have to have faster charging opportunities, and we have to get the equipment charged much more quickly. And there absolutely cannot be any risk that this equipment is going to go down in the middle of a shift, not just for operations, but also for safety. I mean, this is very heavy machinery, and there's a lot that can go wrong. So that's kind of what we're up against now, and I think we're edging towards that, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, I don't have too much else to add other than sharing, I guess, my experience before entering more of the policy world. I spent a number of years in the research world, graduate school at UC Santa Barbara and a postdoc at Cornell studying materials used in hydrogen fuel cells. And the rule of thumb from the technology standpoint is about 20 years after discovery, will something actually make it to a product. So the technology we have today is, outdated from a research standpoint. It's really just trickling up into the manufacturer and OEM world from the bench. And so my experience and perspective of seeing the large number of research groups studying ways to improve fuel cell technology to reduce the amount of platinum in a fuel cell or to increase the energy density in a battery. There's a ton of people working on it, a ton of smart people working on it, and there's been a number of advancements over the last 20 years that we will start to see reach the technology stage, hit the shelves, so to speak.
So, and this question jumps off your answers and to some degree previews a little bit of our afternoon conversation, which will head more into policies and finance questions. But having identified the technological advancements we still need, what do you guys each think are the most important sets of either policies or regulations or incentives, et cetera, that we need to put in place in order to achieve those advancements? In 2 minutes or less. No, kidding. I know it's a big question, but each of you has
We had a
worked in
little
this
bit of a
area for while.
conversation about indirect source rules at AQMD a few weeks ago.
Yeah, you want to talk about the indirect source rule?
Well, it may be necessary, and we hope that we can put something important in place. It's a little touch and go. We'll see what the California Air Resources Board gets done, especially before January. And, you know, I think there are a lot of really good policies in place now. If we could just get people to fulfill those commitments, we'd make a lot of progress. You know, do we need a low NOx regulation for heavy-duty trucks? Absolutely. Should it be adopted right away? Yes. You know, should the federal government do something about locomotives and do it immediately? Absolutely, and yes. Do we have to deal with ships? Yes. We need policies for those things. ARB has a really, I think, went through a process when discussing facility-based measures and indirect source rules to identify priorities. They did a very good job of doing that. I think that those priorities will get us really needed emission reductions at freight facilities. But as much, if not more, of the focus needs to be on implementation of the commitments already made.
I mean, I think funding is a huge challenge. And it's, I mean, we have, our partners, I would say, are very forward thinking about this. We have operators that are definitely willing to test this equipment. You know, they might even be willing to roll it out at a bigger scale, depending on the strings that are attached to the funding. And our challenge now is that although there is funding, it's not always in the time frame that we need it. So a lot of the grants that are on the street right now, you have to have the whole project complete by 2020. Well, if you don't have the infrastructure in place, that's very difficult to do. As you know, we have to go through CEQA. As public agencies, we have a public bidding process that takes a lot of time. So that's very challenging. I mean, I think for us, when we talk about funding, we talk about really having a consistent, predictable stream of funding that can help people get over this hurdle of a zero-emission truck costing 3 times what a diesel truck costs. So that, I think, from a policy perspective, is huge. I also think that the Clean Air Action Plan that I talked about from the Port of Long Beach and Port of Los Angeles, it's a voluntary plan. You know, we can't require our operators or our partners to do some of these things, but they have been really good partners. You know, when there's grant funding, you know, they know this is something that they need to do, and it's coming eventually, and they've been pretty proactive.
There's a lot of policies. It's really the sum of all things is my view of how we get there. And in a lot of ways, just doing more of what we've already done and what the Air Resources Board in particular has done, strengthening the low carbon fuel standard, taking lessons learned from requiring light duty manufacturers to sell zero emission cars in California and doing something similar for heavy duty. Incentive funding for sure in the early days. And in California, we're so lucky that we have a cap and trade pot of money to do this. Other states are going through this VW settlement stuff right now, and this is their first bite at the apple for any type of meaningful incentive funding in their states for cleaner, vehicle technologies. We certainly don't have the level of support federally for incentives that we do for heavy duty, that we do for light duty. There's a $7,500 tax credit for light duty electric cars. There's not something equivalent for heavy duty. So, in an administration change, I think that's an area we could, get help so that California isn't doing it all per se. Other states need to step up. The Public Utilities Commission, that decision it's such an exciting decision last week. And
do you want to describe it? I know a lot of us are familiar with it, but.
Yeah, so this came out of SB 350, California's, landmark 50% RPS bill. That bill also had language saying Public Utilities Commission, direct the investor-owned utilities in the state, Edison, PG&E, San Diego Gas and Electric, direct them to come to you with proposals for how you're going to advance, quote-unquote, widespread electrification. Edison and PG&E, they submitted proposals to electrify heavy-duty, medium and heavy-duty vehicles. So they will provide the infrastructure. If you are a fleet owner that has a purchase order for 10 electric trucks, PG&E or Edison will install they'll do the trenching, all the electrical upgrades needed to get you a charger for that truck. And so last week, $760 million of these proposals were approved. Now becomes the task of getting this money out to fleets, the ports to use it. It'll happen over 5 years, which will, it's a big chunk of money for 5 years, as big as anything we've really seen. So that's where the excitement comes from, is that it really is a first of its kind. That came from legislative direction. So kudos to the state legislature that did that.
Can I jump in on the funding thing for just a sec?
Please.
It's really important to have the incentive funding right now, and there's this outstanding question of who's going to pay for what. Very few people are really working on it. Denny back there, Denny Zane from Move LA, he's working on it, trying to figure that out. But the point at which it's really going to take off is when we no longer have to rely upon the incentive funding, when zero emission is actually a better investment. And you're seeing that with the smaller forklifts right now. People aren't buying, other forklifts because the battery electric forklifts are the best investment. And when we flip, when we get to that point, then it's no longer a problem we're going to have all-day seminars and conferences about, because it'll take care of itself. But we have to figure out how we get to that point.
So I have more questions for you guys, but I know we have a room full of fabulous folks, and I want to see if anybody at this point wants to jump in. I see a hand up here. Is anybody willing to wrangle some mics for us? Great, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Christoph LaBelle, Master of Public Policy student here, graduating in a week. So
Congratulations.
thank you. Renee's a graduate of the same program, so hence the shout out earlier. So I'm wondering, with these the testing of these vehicles going on here, how can we ensure they are used here? Once they're marketable and so on, ready for companies to want to put them into their fleets as opposed to going somewhere else.
So I actually think it would be fantastic if this equipment was going to other places, because one of the things that we know about this industry is our terminal operators, these companies, they've got locations all over the country, all over the world, and they're looking for fleet solutions, not just for Los Angeles and Long Beach. They need solutions that are going to apply for all of their facilities. So we can't have boutique operations down here in LA and Long Beach. And that's one of the issues that we're coming up against. These big companies are looking to make investments in zero emissions, but if it works down here in Long Beach, well, how will that work in Oakland or Seattle or some of the other ports that they work with? So while I think the incentive funding, that equipment must stay here, they need to be able to really institutionalize this into their normal corporate structure. I think that's kind of what Joe was referring to. It's going to get to the point where it's just a part of doing business, and that's where we would hope to see this equipment deployed everywhere.
I'm biased. I want them to use it here. We're not getting the cleanest locomotives. We're not getting the cleanest ships. I wish that the locomotive companies would send us their cleanest locomotives. I wish the shipping companies would send us their cleanest ships. That's really important. It's not happening, and we really have to figure out how to get that done. You must have passed Cliff's class. Congratulations. I enjoyed doing the guest lecture there, and thank you for volunteering at the Coalition for Clean Air Awards. They can and do put conditions on incentive funding that you have to use it here if we fund it, so that will continue to happen. But there is a need to get cleaner ships and cleaner locomotives to California and especially to South Coast Air Basin.
What about including in these ports master plans, like the ones at Long Beach, housing for truck drivers, or like hotels or something for truck drivers, when their trucks are being recharged overnight or during rest periods, and fields of electric chargers, and maybe truck valets to help the truck drivers while they're getting their rest and their vehicles are being charged. The valets to wrangle their trucks and connect them and disconnect them from the chargers and move them to parking spaces, maybe on some of the lots where the Volkswagens are parked now. What do you think about planning to accommodate electric trucks and the drivers in that sort of way?
I think that's you, Renee, maybe?
So that needs to be part of the planning. It's not just about getting the technology. It's not just about getting the infrastructure. It is about how do we support the operational environment of these owners. And I think we need to look at things like that. What are some of the supportive elements that would help to facilitate the more widespread adoption of these types of technologies?
I see a couple hands in the back.
Ready?
Oh, sorry, the mic's already with someone.
Hi there, Ian Stewart, RPS. To your point about locomotives and ships, the OEMs are likely not going to support new technology because of their focus on getting a usable vehicle to market. And I'd like to see more focus on local companies like ours that have the capability to leverage the existing equipment and convert it to pure electric. Local companies that are supporting the local economy, that are directly interested in the efficiency and the productivity of our local region. And I had a question for, there seemed to be a disconnect between the two presentations on all of the technology information that you provided, Jimmy. I wonder if the customer base wants any of those things. The acceleration run, that's nice, but does a truck driver care if he beats a Prius on the freeway when he has to pull over in 2 miles because he's out of charge?
No, yeah, for sure, a good point. I think there's certainly some myths associated with electric technology that I think that video goes to address. And I'll be the first to acknowledge that all of the ranges that I listed underneath those trucks, I mean, those are sticker ranges. You know, fleets need to go through the test process and see, you know, what kind of ranges they're going to get when they're operating in their duty cycles, and you know, when they're running the AC or something down here. So there's a lot of kinks to work out. But I guess I see, you know, the electric truck that takes a load from the port to, you know, Shafter or Bakersfield, you know, a distribution center way out there, you know, that's a little harder problem than ones nearby, and we need to go for the easy ones first. And what I see is that there are a lot of opportunities to for the technology to operate in the near term for certain case scenarios.
I see you took Joe's advocacy lesson to heart. Concede what you can concede, right? Peter.
Hi, I just had a question about, is battery waste disposal keeping pace with these projected advances, and where do all the batteries go, and at the end of the other end of the cycle? And you know, that may not be specifically a port impact, but it's an impact somewhere. So just looking at the totality of the system, where is waste disposal in relationship to electrification?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, light duty vehicles have been on the road for about 8 years. Nissan Leaf came out in December 2010. Tesla Roadster was out a couple years before that. So we're really just beginning to reach the end of life of the first generation of light duty vehicles. It's a question that we have to address. Phil Ting in the State Assembly has a bill, I think right yeah, right now that would maybe start addressing some of this. That just folks to start thinking, get a task force to start thinking about this critically. The solutions that people talk about are secondary lives as storage operations. There's certainly economic considerations there that right now it's cheaper to pull material out of the ground. The good news is that a lithium-ion battery, we're not talking about lead batteries. We're not talking about the Xi type disaster that we have down here. I guess I'm confident. I guess I go back to my optimism and what I see as innovation and really the smarts of the research community to innovate around this problem that we're going to have of what do you do with batteries when they're done being used in a vehicle.
This is a good opportunity to tout one of the products that has come out of this research collaborative between Berkeley and UCLA with support from Bank of America. We did a, FYI, we've done a research report on second life use of used batteries. I encourage you all to check it out. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. I see some hands in the back. Is that you, Denny? Yes, thank you.
Hi, yes, Denny Zane, Move LA. My question is about funding and the need for funding and what might be able to be accomplished if we had funding. So envision that perhaps there was a reliable funding source of about $700 million a year available for 15, 20 years. Would we be able with that resource to reach the kind of moment that Joe talked about where the technology really becomes self-sustaining in the marketplace, call it an inflection point perhaps, with that kind of funding? Joe, Jimmy, Cara?
I don't know, and I think it's impossible to tell for sure. There's a lot of companies that are paying a few really smart battery technology developers a lot of money to try to figure this out. But I think we have to make clear that in the air quality management plan that South Coast AQMD adopted, it was presumed that those investments would go to more cost-effective emission reductions with near zero emission technology in order to get to attainment by the deadline, not that would go into zero emission technology with the hope that we would reach this inflection point and then the market would take over and we would still make it. So it's a little bit apples and oranges as to how that money can and should be invested and where and when we reach that point in which we no longer have to provide incentives in order to get people to use the technology. I'm not sure what that answer is.
I would also say that the initial capital investment is going to be significant. But beyond that, there's significant fuel savings. So depending on the price of electricity, a lot of our operators are interested in zero emissions because they don't have to pay those fuel costs anymore, which is a huge expense for them. And the maintenance costs are likely to be lower than the diesel equipment. So I think if we can use the incentive funding to get past that initial hurdle of the capital investment, and then it becomes part of their operations, that's going to help significantly.
Okay, last question. Over on the side, great. Thanks.
Yes, so all this talk about zero emissions sort of belies the fact that it's zero tailpipe emissions, and Mary Nichols talked about some of the sort of broader questions that happen in all the different moving parts. To what degree is this conversation looking at the generation of the electricity that makes these vehicles possible and how that is zero emissions? Understanding that our electric grid is moving much more quickly toward zero emissions, our renewable portfolio than our point source. But where does that sort of enter into this conversation?
Absolutely. A big part of UCS, my colleagues' work, is cleaning up the electricity grid. And we're doing quite well, especially in California. The grid is clean, and my tagline is, it's getting cleaner. We're going to exceed our RPS goals by 50% by 2030. We're probably 4 years ahead of that, which is why people are advocating for conversations around 100% goal. And so like I showed, even today on today's grid, we're cleaner than conventional technologies. But absolutely, we have until the last coal fired power plant is shut down, there's still going to be emissions from that plant that need to be reduced. Coal will be off of California's imports by 2025. And so you see this steady decline. That's where a good chunk of our emissions declines over the last number of years have come. It's from the power sector.
Yeah, this is happening. It's really good news. We've reached that inflection point with large-scale solar, really inexpensive, much less expensive than everything else. So, people are going for it, and we'll see increases, and more containers will move on Sunshine, which is what ultimately we need to happen. And I think the focus point really needs to be on storage and on what to do with excess electricity at the times at that belly of the duck curve when we have too much, and what we're going to do with it and how we're going to use it, whether it's going to be power to gas and hydrogen generation and making hydrogen less expensive, or storing it in electrons and batteries on a temporary basis and then using that to power freight movement. There's a lot of that needs to happen too, but I think the focus right now really needs to be, because I think that the renewable energy thing is kind of taking care of itself, in some ways, and the focus needs to be on the storage part.
Great. Okay, with that, I think we're ready to head to lunch. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a terrific discussion. And then my colleague Sean has instructions for us about how to do lunch.